And Christianity is unique in that these are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, in the generation of the eyewitnesses. So that builds a very compelling case that these are historically authentic writings. Yeah, it's great to be with you, Mel. It's Evidence and Answers. We're based here in Hawaii.
Okay. Thank you for joining me on the Bible Professor podcast. We're talking about the 12 points that show Christianity is true. Pat, I happen to know that you're very, very familiar with these 12 points. I do want to ask you, though, about apologetics and your definition of it. First of all, what is apologetics? What do you tell people there, out in public when they ask you, what is that?
Yes, outside many of the Christian scholarly contexts, they think that's apologizing to everybody. But apologetics is from the Greek term apologia, to make a rational reasoned defense. 1 Peter 3, it's commanded of us in 1 Peter 3:15 to always be prepared to give an answer, an apologia, a well-reasoned, rational defense of the hope that you have within you. So apologetics, as I define it, is giving reasons and answers for how we know Christianity is true.
Okay. Thank you, Pat. We're joined by Pat Zuckeran. He's in Hawaii. I'm still here in North Carolina, but 12 points that show Christianity is true. Pat, when you're discussing with people, I have seen you do a lecture on the internet, on YouTube, on point number 6, but are there a couple of the 12 points that you're more passionate about that you find that you use in your context more often?
Yes, because I'm in the arena of historical apologetics. That's kind of my arena. I'm getting my another doctorate in biblical archaeology. And so I really like the arena of archaeology and the arena of historical apologetics. So, of course, defending the historical reliability of the Bible, and specifically the historical reliability of the Gospels, is one that I really enjoy, because instead of trying to defend the historical reliability of the whole Bible, if you can just defend the historical reliability of the Gospels, then indeed what Christ said about him is true. We've got an accurate historical record of Christ, who claimed to be the divine Son of God, and he confirmed his claim. If we can demonstrate the historical reliability of the Gospels, then essentially, Christ is who he said he was, and Christianity is true.
Okay, I like that. So you've kind of narrowed your focus, which I always, every semester, my seminary students, when they have to write papers for New Testament survey, it's almost 100% of the time I have them to narrow their focus. They, always go too broad with their topics. Narrow, narrow, narrow. So you've narrowed to the Gospels. So what is it about the Gospels? How can we even begin to defend the Gospels?
Well, I like to start with the date of the Gospels. When were they written? Because
Second century, right?
yeah, most of us know. Most of us know it takes about 100 years for legends to develop, and we see that in many of the historical writings. you know they're written centuries after the lifetime of the founders. And Christianity is unique in that these are written within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, in the generation of the eyewitnesses. So that builds a very compelling case that these are historically authentic writings, because there's too many eyewitnesses who are around who can corroborate your testimony as true or false. If I try to spread some kind of biography about John F. Kennedy, that after he was shot, was taken to Parkland, and 3 days later rose from the dead, and hundreds of people saw him walking around Dallas, Fort Worth, I'd be laughed out of the city in a minute. Just too many eyewitnesses, even 60 years later, Mel, who can corroborate my testimony as false. And you got the Gospels being written and circulated in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And remember, it's a very hostile arena. This is not a pro-Christian Israel. They're trying to present the
Yes.
evidence and message of Christ in. And so they're being scrutinized. And so their testimony, their preaching, and the Gospels could have never survived had it not been true. So I like to start with the date of the Gospels, and we can build a very compelling case that it was written well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses.
Okay. So, well, first of all, so I wanna develop that just a little bit, but you've made me think of something here, um, and I'm not sure if you were emphasizing this, but the lack of writings during the time of the writings of the apostles about the death and resurrection of Jesus, nobody's writing that, hey, no, this did not happen. Nobody's contradicting what they're saying, right? Because it was common knowledge and it was verifiable.
Yes, yes. And, that's stunning that nobody is, in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses writing to refute what the apostles said. They're trying to give alternative explanations, but really they're facts. Nobody is contradicting them. Mel and I, you and I write, and often, when our writings get into, I mean, people scrutinize our writings. I've been sued over having footnotes that were allegedly wrong,
Wow.
you know, and so, if we're scrutinized on our writings, imagine these apostles
Hmm.
trying to, convince the Jews this guy you crucified as a criminal is indeed the Messiah. You bet. Not only their preaching and teaching, but their writing was scrutinized, and they'll scrutinize everything to discredit you. If they can't discredit you, they'll go after your wife, your grandma, your grandpa, your dog, your cat. I mean, they're just bloodless. And so the fact that, as you mentioned, there's silence here, nobody writing to refute the facts these guys were presenting is quite stunning.
Okay. Yeah. So there's a lack of refutation. There's eyewitnesses. This is just common knowledge of what happened. We're talking about the gospel specifically, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. So back to the dating issue then. Those of us that are evangelicals, conservative theological evangelicals that actually believe the text of Scripture was written in the first century, we have reasons we believe that. How can we begin to share that with folks here?
Yeah, well, one of the most powerful is the internal evidence. Matthew, Mark, and Luke prophesy, record one of Jesus' most important prophecies of the destruction of the temple, but they never record its fulfillment. That's very strange. Many times they'll record a prophecy of Jesus, like John chapter 2, when Jesus said, destroy this temple in 3 days and I'll raise it, speaking of the temple of his body. And then they record its fulfillment. Especially in Luke, you have those couplings where Jesus makes a prophecy and Luke says, and it was fulfilled here. But of the temple, one of the most important prophecies, the destruction of Israel's most important historic building that Jesus prophesies, even to this day, the temple remains one of the most important structures in the history of the life of the people of Israel. The remaining Temple Mount is a sacred place. And so not to record its fulfillment is very strange. Most likely, it's because the Gospels were written before the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. So you build a good case the Gospels are in prior to 70 AD. That's within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. More compelling, though, is the book of Acts. Acts
Mhm.
is written after the Gospel of Luke. And Acts, we can build a good case. It's written prior to 62 AD. It doesn't record the destruction of the temple. The temple is a active place where the apostles are going to, and is still a prominent thing in the lifetime of the people of Israel. Luke never records its destruction. And then Luke ends on a very weird note. Paul under house arrest, and people were allowed to visit him. And suddenly it ends. Kind of strange ending there. Never records the death of its most prominent characters here, Peter
Mhm.
and Paul, and they died in 65 AD under Nero. That's well documented. and affirmed by historians on all sides. So therefore, Acts is done before 65 AD. But then he never records the death of James, the leader of the church. He died in about 62 AD, and so if Acts, let's just give round numbers, is written about 60 AD, now it's well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And then, the gospel of, in Timothy, 1 Timothy 5:18, Paul quotes the gospel of Luke.
Yes.
And so he's quoting the Gospel of Luke's already around. He knows it's inspired scripture and he quotes it. And so if Acts is written, let's say 60 AD, the Gospel of Luke precedes the book of Acts. And so let's just give round numbers here, 55 AD. I mean, wow, you're well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses here.
We're talking with Pat Zuckeran, who is in Hawaii on this episode. The Gospels of the New Testament are historically reliable. Pat, you mentioned working on another doctorate, this one in biblical archaeology. Can you talk about maybe a couple of archaeological finds or artifacts that may help with the dating of the Gospels?
Well, yes, one of the great things about the New Testament is the abundancy of manuscripts. In fact, we might have too many for the New Testament. It's just compelling. You've got over 5,000 ancient manuscripts. Uh, you things like the Ryland papyri. I mean, that dates about 120 AD. That's a fragment of the Gospel of John, and that was found in Egypt. So remember, they don't have email or
Yeah.
Xerox back then. Hard for some of us young folks here to comprehend, but they had to
Yes.
write it down with hand. And so John wrote his gospel somewhere in Turkey, right? And then it got copied and copied and copied and made its way all the way down to Egypt, where the Rylands fragment was found 120 AD. So if you go backwards, it's well within the first century, very close. It's only about 20, 25 years, 30 years, 20 to 30 years after the lifetime of John. So you've got a very early manuscript there. Then you've got, over 5,000 ancient Greek manuscripts. On top of that, you've got translations, Coptic, Syriac, Jerome's Latin Vulgate,
Mm-hmm.
translations, fragments, all together 24,000 ancient manuscripts, which also confirm the accurate preservation and transmission of the New Testament. You've got quotes from the church fathers, people like Clement of Rome writing as early as 90 AD, Ignatius, Papias.
Yeah, Pat, I always think that's a really sorry to interrupt you, but that to me is a very strong case for the dating of the New Testament, the Gospels. When you have guys writing just
Yeah.
before the turn of the century and just a few years after, and they're quoting some of the New Testament books, well, logic tells you those books have already written if they're able to quote from them.
Yeah. And they've recognized them as, inspired authoritative writings. They're quoting them like the Old Testament. And so it takes a while
Yeah,
for
man,
that.
that's another good point. So you've already got a core canon, as Michael Kruger, I'm sure you're familiar with him. He
Mhm.
calls it a core canon was already, manifesting itself. So, that's a whole nother topic, canonicity. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Yeah, and then, you've also got historical writings from what we might call anti-Christian historians, Jewish
hmm
and Romans. These guys don't really like Christianity, and you can see it in their writings. And, your audience who's familiar with, the court system know that when you have testimony from a hostile, the hostile witnesses, that's some of the most powerful testimony in court, when they corroborate your account. They have really no reason to do so. And that's what these Roman and Jewish historians do. We've got writings from the Talmud, Josephus, Jewish historians that corroborate many of the people, places, and events surrounding Jesus and especially his crucifixion. Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, these Roman historians who really don't like Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They corroborate many of the facts and people of the Gospels, affirming Jesus is a historical person who lived quite a unique life. And many believed after he was crucified that, somehow risen from the dead. So you've got non-Christian historians who affirm many of the facts of the Gospels. And, as historians, we know when you have hostile witnesses affirming your testimony, that's one of the marks of an authentic historical document. And then when it comes to archaeology, those of us in the arena of biblical archaeology, the historicity of the Gospels, it's almost a closed case already. I mean, the argument's almost done that indeed the Gospels are historically reliable. We have found thousands, I mean, I'm not exaggerating here, of archaeological discoveries, coins, inscriptions,
Mm-hmm.
plaques, affirming people, places, and events, of the New Testament. Recent news, we're uncovering more of the Pool of Siloam, where
Yes.
Jesus healed the crippled man. Um, and we found the ossuary of Herod the Great, there in his tomb in the Herodium
Mm-hmm.
over there. And when you read the historical writings of Herod, a lot of people question, oh, there's no outside historical writing about all these kids dying in Bethlehem, Herod killing all these kids in Bethlehem, and therefore the Gospels must be false. Well, read the stories of Herod. When he died, he wanted to be buried in the Herodium, and he wanted it to be a day of mourning. And he knew the Jews wouldn't be sad at his death. So he ordered his brother to round up all the royalty in
Mm-hmm.
Israel and kill them all when he died. So it would
Yeah.
truly be a day of mourning. Well, that's consistent with a guy who would say, hey, those guys in the little town of Bethlehem on the outskirts there, kill everyone two years old and younger. I mean, it's consistent. So
Right.
yeah, when it comes to archaeology, we've got manuscripts, we've got non-Christian historical writings, we've got archaeological discoveries, coins, plaques, inscriptions. One of the most significant, Mel, is the Gospel of Luke. He uh, consistently affirms to be accurate on the people, places, and events, especially, in detailed matters like the title of government officials, Licinius, Tetrarch of Abilene, Gallio, Proconsul of Achaia, Pluvius, first man of the island. I mean, these kind of strange titles.
Mm-hmm.
People thought maybe he's mistaken or something. Well, we found inscriptions and coins that found him to be dead on accurate. And so when you have a historian like Luke and Matthew and others who are dead on accurate on these little details, well, you can be confident when it comes to the major things they're writing about, they're accurate. It's like when you got a witness on the stand, and he might be the only witness to a crime, like several of my friends were. And if they can accurately, what color shirt was the guy wearing? What was it? What time did all this happen? Was there anything? What kind of car was he driving? I mean, if he gets it, just nails these kinds of details over and over and over again, you can say we've got a reliable witness here and you can
Yeah.
count on his testimony. And that's what we got with the Gospels.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Pat Zuckeran talking about the historical reliability of the Gospels. Do you have any other elements there you'd like to share?
What's interesting is you do a comparison of other, historical works of the other major religions. I mean, Muhammad's biography, we don't have one till about 200 years after the life of Muhammad. And
Interesting.
it's written by Ibn Ishaq, who's, hundreds of miles away. He's not in Mecca writing this. He's hundreds of miles away, I think in Damascus, out there writing the biography 200 years later, you know. And what kind of archaeology do we have on the life of Muhammad? Well, we have very little. And we should have a ton. You know, if Mecca is the oldest city, as the Quran says,
Right.
Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, they were cast down to Mecca. I mean, we should have archaeology all over Mecca, yellow tape everywhere, like you see
Yeah.
in Jerusalem. That's
Point.
not what you see in Mecca. You know, the earliest biography of the Buddha, you know, and I've been to his birthplace and other significant places there in India and Nepal. Earliest biography, according to Edward Conzi, wrote a great book there. It's about 400 years later. And so a lot of historians question, you know, the historical integrity, even, you know, were these actually real people? Because their biographies are so late and there's not that much archaeology when it comes to Christ. Man, you've got uh, records, you know, in the lifetime of the eyewitnesses, and shortly thereafter, you've got non-Christian, hostile witnesses corroborating what these gospel writers are writing. You've got thousands of archaeological discoveries. I mean, wow! Now you know there's really no comparison there.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, point 6 of the 12 points, the New Testament is historically reliable, and Pat Zuckeran has shared about the reliability of the Gospels specifically. I really appreciate your input, brother.
Yes, great to be here on the show with you, Mel, and you know, God bless you for your great work out there. And of course, you and I are graduates of Southern Evangelical, so great school out there. I recommend that school, and we've sent several people from the Pacific and Hawaii there to Southern Evangelical.
Yes, sir. Thank you. One more thing, Pat, I am very familiar with your book, The Apologetics of Jesus, that you authored with Norman Geisler. It's called a subtitle, A Caring Approach to Dealing with Doubters. Can you take just a few seconds or a minute to talk about that book? And then maybe if you have any recent publications you want to share or mention?
Yes, you know, I jokingly say that's Dr. Geisler's greatest book that he ever wrote. And the reason is nobody knew who the second author was. A lot of times schools would call me and say, "Can you teach apologetics?" And I said, "Sure." And they said, "By the way, we're using a book. Be great if you read it. It's called The Apologetics of Jesus by Norman Beck." And I finally got uh um what's the word? Not tired of it, but finally had to realize I need a comeback here. And so
Yep.
I would tell the schools, you know, that's Dr. Geisler's greatest book he ever wrote. And they'd be like, really? And I said, he co-authored that with someone else. I heard that guy's pretty good too in apologetics. And they'd be like, really? I'd be
There
like,
you
who?
go.
You know? And once they found out, they get a good laugh about it. But
Yeah. But tell people if they're not familiar with that book, what your approach there is, because it's unique.
yeah, one of the things that Dr. Geisler would say in his class is that Jesus is the greatest apologist, and someone needs to write a book on it. And, you know, after class, I went up to him and I said, well, I'd like to do my doctoral work on that. Because a lot of people don't realize apologetics was a tremendous part of Jesus' ministry. He didn't just come out and say, hey, I'm the divine Son of God, take my word for it.
Yeah.
He confirmed his claim through well-reasoned arguments. He pointed out false teachings, uh, and presented, exposed the error in a very skillful, articulate way. He used miracles. He used the testimony of witnesses from prophets to the Old Testament scriptures to Moses to God the Father in a very masterful way and often very creative and ingenious ways. Uh, Jesus presented a powerful, indisputable case of, you know, who he said he was, and he confirmed it. And so apologetics was a very integral, important part of the ministry of Jesus. And if it was, his example, it was carried on by the apostles who followed his example. And if it's a was an important part of Jesus and the apostles, then it should be a part of ours as well. And so we showed how Jesus used apologetics in his ministry and how it serves as a model for all of us in our ministry.
Pat, do you have any other recent writings or publications you want to mention?
Well, I have my book on the world religions, God, eternity, and spirituality. We have um, a book that Dr. Geisler endorsed, a very easy apologetics book, Unless I See, Is There Enough Evidence to Believe, written, you know, uh, for you, not only to introduce you to this fine arena of apologetics, but to give, to someone who's not a believer in Christ. Then we've got a booklet series on the cults and biblical archaeology. A lot of the essays and projects I had to do for class, we turned them into booklets on, case for the Exodus, the historical reliability of Gospels, case for the Mosaic authorship of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and more are coming out. So, and our website, of course, evidenceandanswers.org, numerous articles that you will find there, and podcasts. We're on Spotify and YouTube. So evidenceandanswers.org is a tremendous resource. A lot of the stuff is free. So tremendous resource for many students and Christians out there who interested in this whole arena of apologetics.
Pat Zuckeran, thank you for joining me on the Bible Professor. Appreciate it.
Yes, great to be with you, Mel.
Okay, and I'll put the link to Pat's ministry website in the description below. You've been listening to the Bible Professor. Be blessed. Okay, you will want to be sure you watch the next video in this series on the 12 points that show Christianity's true. I think it'll be a challenge for you, an encouragement, and a blessing to you. Be sure to place any comments below and, get in on the conversation about these 12 points. Be sure to like and subscribe and share this with others on your social media. Okay, be blessed. Bye-bye.